So there was a famous show that the Dead played at the Fillmore East on 2/13/70, and they played this
Yeah.
crazy Dark Star. It was one of the early Dick's picks that was released on there. And I literally have a group that every time it's 2:13, somebody in the group will just take a picture of the clock or write 2:13 or something. Nothing else, just 2:13.
And everybody knows.
Yeah. So why does music matter? Well, I stay connected to my people, to my community through that music as well. And so, it is so inextricably a part of my life and my being. It's hard to imagine any other way.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Why Music Matters podcast. I'm your host, music journalist and musician Jeff Myers. Throughout my life in and around music, I've often asked myself the question, why does music matter? This podcast will attempt to answer that question with the help of musicians, members of the music industry, and music lovers like you. Today on Why Music Matters, my guest is Peter Connors, musicologist, novelist, Grateful Dead scholar, and a hero of mine for the way he's devoted his life to exploring the connection between the majesty of music and the power of the written word. Whether it's his nonfiction works like Growing Up Dead, the hallucinated confessions of a teenage deadhead, Cornell 77, the music, the myth, and the magnificence of the Grateful Dead's concert at Barton Hall, and White Hand Society, the psychedelic partnership of Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg, or his recent novel, Merch Table Blues, Peter's writing reads like my favorite music sounds. Join us as Peter shares some insight on getting shown the light in the strangest of places. Peter, how are you, man? Oh, I can't hear. I gotta need my headphones. Not that new at this. Hey, buddy. Can you hear me?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too, man. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. This is cool. I love it.
Yeah, it's super cool. Well, welcome to Why Music Matters. Grateful Dead scholar, author, musicologist, poet, novelist now, and just a good dude. Peter Connors, welcome, man.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you had a wonderful summer. I did see you pop in on Dead Air at least once. It looked like you were vacationing and taking some well-earned time off, but I hope it was a good one.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to those guys and just sort of geek out about the band. Yeah, and I actually got to catch Dead and Company in Boulder too, so that was fun.
Yeah, it was good, and I do want to talk about that a little bit later, but I wanted to kind of start with, how I was introduced to you was I got a copy of Growing Up Dead in the mail. And I identified immediately because I think we kind of came to the band in a similar way. And at kind of the same time, my first show was June 27th, 85 at SPAC. The one that got them banned from SPAC for a couple years after that because it was so oversold. But anyway, my reaction to my first show is not unlike the one you describe in the book. And funnily enough, that SPAC show also had a Crazy Fingers. And you described that as the song that, quote, flash soldered my inner and outer worlds. I love that line, dude. But I'm wondering if you can talk about that experience a bit, both the lyrics and the kind of sonic architecture of that song on that night, at Kingswood in 1987. I bet it's still somewhat fresh.
Yeah, well, that line in specific that I was talking about was reaching for the gold ring down inside.
Yeah.
And so, and it's funny, I will tell you that book came out about 10 years ago, and I have not thought much about that particular passage since then. But I get goosebumps when I'm describing it right now because, what I really meant by that flash soldering the sort of childhood and current together was I would go with a friend to Martha's Vineyard sometimes in the summer. His family would take me up there, and there was a place called Oak Bluffs that had a old school merry-go-round where you would actually reach for that little brass ring as you ran around. It's the only one that I've ever seen. But it was, it was a really neat thing when I was a kid, and it always stood out to me as a unique experience. And so when, I'm at a Grateful Dead concert and I'm still a teenager and I'm not that far away, only a few years out from that experience. And, just really in with the music and with the people and dancing and feeling that. And, the Dead was masterful with this. And, Robert Hunter's lyrics, especially, and John Barlow's too. But, they, as you mentioned, I'm a poet and I'm also a poetry editor, and I work with language really closely. And the ability that Robert Hunter had in particular to crystallize a moment with just a few words is what poets dream of doing, and lyricists as well. So that's a great example. It's such in its own way, it's a very simple line. It's really straightforward, and it could go right past you, or it could hit you like an arrow in the chest.
That's right.
And you go like, oh my God, that's me. And so that was the experience I had with that song at that moment. But it got replicated over and over and over. And so I think for me, being let's say a young poet who loved language and was not doing well in school and sort of not fitting into that scene, and I think was looking for community in that way, and also like interested in learning things that you don't learn in school, that they weren't teaching it. I didn't even know what those things were. But I knew when I went to my first Dead show and started to get into it that there was a lot to learn there that they didn't teach you in school.
To back up to the end of it a little bit, like what about the way those lyrics, which Hunter, I said this earlier, but I feel like Hunter belongs right next to Dylan, at least in my cosmos, as just brilliant observations whittled down to the most essential words, like you said, a poet's dream, right? But the way that Garcia would marry his melodies to those lyrics, I guess that's the core of why we're still talking about this, right? For me, the Dead is about songwriting first, always. I don't know if a lot of people get that, but that's what's up. But hearing it like that Kingswood show, your first show, when you first were hearing those lyrics, like, with Garcia, too, he was in pretty good shape, right, at the time? He was singing well and playing well. Can you remember that? And you're like, okay, all of a sudden you're like, well, this is everything. Because it comes at you quick, right? You're like, holy shit, man, revelation, I've been changed,
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think, going back to the Dylan comment, when you think about it, other than their own songs, whose songs did they cover the most? Like Dylan, right? So,
absolutely.
And that's, the reason for that. And it's not like necessarily the melodies. It's, when we talk about Dylan, we usually talk about the lyrics. And, I think it's important for people to remember, too, that the Grateful Dead are a very literate band. I think particularly when it comes to the songwriting or the influences, the allusions in the music, they're ripe with literature. And the guys were all readers, and they were all, intellectuals who were also musicians.
Totally.
And so, I think that comparison with Dylan is really apt. And again, as somebody who loved language, my first real heavy flash with them was the song Ripple.
Yeah. Wow.
And so I had heard, a friend gave me a bootleg of a show at Hershey Park in 1985, and they played a Tom Thumb's Blues. So now we're back to Dylan, right? So they played a Tom Thumb's Blues, and that was the weirdest thing I had ever heard any band do. I had no frame of reference for it. I was a child of the 70s who had older brothers. So my musical experience was really deep into Boston and Foreigner and Kansas and Styx and REO Speedwagon and, whatever was on the radio. Mm-hmm. And I could sing you the lyrics, and I still can sing you the lyrics because they're so burned into my brain, to all of those albums,
Totally.
And so when I was confronted with a line like, there is a fountain that was not made by the hands of man, and other lyrics like that, particularly in Ripple. Again, as somebody who loves language, as a young person, like looking to find their groove, I didn't, it was just blew my mind. And then, I heard that on the American Beauty album. So I had the American Beauty album with Ripple, and I had this Tom Thumb's Blues from Hershey Park. And I also couldn't imagine how the same band made that music. I was like, there's no way these Tom Thumb's Blues weirdos were making, a song like Ripple that sounds like it just descended, from the sky. And
perfectly formed. There. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, perfectly formed. It's like, it's like an old folk ballad or something like that you just, who knows where it came from, and it'll never go away. It's like, it's just there. And so that combination I found incredibly intriguing, and again, it just sort of led me down that rabbit hole of like, who are these people, and, where do they come from? And I will say it opened up, in addition to their own music, it did open me up to, I had never heard of like beat writers before. I've never heard of Jack Kerouac or any of these people.
It leads right to it.
It leads right to it. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's in a weird way, it's a very short leap from Jerry Garcia to Dostoevsky.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, actually.
Right? So it's like, my writer's education in a weird way was opened up through the Dead and through that little slice of lyrics, which led me to this and this and this. And I did, I was not doing well in school, but I was really hungry to learn, and I wanted to feed my head, and they helped me do that.
Yeah, man. Well, very well put. Still on Growing Up Dead. There's some commentary in here about, as you and I are both Generation Xers, right? Our birthright was cynicism. Or at least skepticism, but no, cynicism, and I mean, our musical heroes of the day, not that, I mean, obviously there's darkness with Jerry and drugs and everything, but, I mean, it was a lot darker with, Lane Staley and Kurt Cobain, but you mentioned in the book, when it came to the Dead, it was just impossible to be cynical about the experiences we've had with this music. And I find that, this podcast is called Why Music Matters. I'm trying to get at this kind of thing, like music's ability to elevate and change in meaningful and lasting ways. I feel like when you write that in the book, and it's the same way I feel about it, that's profound to me. That gets at music's ability to speak to what's best in us and to maybe help us grow towards what's best in us. Am I just full of shit, or do you feel that too?
No, the only thing that I'm laughing at, because I think that I wrote it, I think it's a quote from my book, was that it's impossible to be cynical about that. And of course, I've met many, many people who are very cynical about the Grateful Dead.
No question.
I should restate that, it is, let's even say it's not in my best interest or even healthy to be cynical about my experiences with the Grateful Dead, because it's denying a really transformative experience that I had. So, I could deny that, I could push it away, and I could act like it doesn't matter or whatever like that. But it's, that's a hoax. It's not real, because it does matter, and the Grateful Dead matters tremendously to me to this day. And I still listen to the Grateful Dead every day. I still have my text groups, that talk about the Grateful Dead almost every day. So there was a famous show that the Dead played at the Fillmore East on 2/13/70, and they played this Crazy Dark Star. It was one of the early Dick's picks that was released on there. And I literally have a group that every time it's 2:13, somebody in the group will just take a picture of the clock or write 2:13 or something. Nothing else, just 2:13.
And everybody knows.
Yeah. So why does music matter? Well, I stay connected to my people, to my community through that music as well. And so, it is so inextricably a part of my life and my being. It's hard to imagine any other way.
Now, do you feel like, along with that, I feel like comes a sort of not being satisfied just accepting who we've been told we are or who we're supposed to be? In other words, it was easier to be cynical then. I think it's protective, right? But it feels somehow I don't want to say revolutionary, but I guess personally, you know, a personal revolution to be like, actually, I'm going to define myself and make some choices toward that rather than I'm just accepting what's, you know, authority up here and, you know, my people down here and peers and all that. Do you feel like, you know, Music of the Dead in particular helped you with that?
Yeah, it's funny. My brain immediately goes to dancing, and so I can't, separate dancing from the Grateful Dead, and I'm not, a trained dancer in any way. But I will say physically moving my body to that music was a massive key to liberating myself from those sort of shackles that I had as a self-conscious, teenager, suburban teenager who was growing up, in the late 80s and Reagan and Just Say No, and all this stuff. And so people, guys didn't dance.
No,
Guys,
it wasn't cool.
No, it wasn't cool. You could stand in the corner and slouch and smoke a cigarette, and you don't dance and you don't move, and that's girls dance, and then whatever. And so I danced, but first I saw people dancing, and I was like, that looks fun, and they look really free and happy, and then I started to move, and then I just realized that I could make my body do those things. And almost, in some way, like, it's impossible to stay cynical when you've liberated your body in that way and you're just moving to the music and you're in this space. Like, there's really nothing to be cynical about if you can disengage that sort of judgmental part of your brain, that self-judgmental, and also, judging the outside world, and you just sort of get into that zone. So, if not for the music, the dancing wouldn't have happened. But in a lot of ways, I think allowing myself the freedom to move in that way was a massive way to remove those blocks. And I do that to this day completely. I mean, if you see me at a show, like, I'm dancing like a maniac. I don't care that I'm 53, because the experience that I have with my body and with my mind is the exact same.
That's right.
All bullshit that we go through every day, and all the being a professional, being a parent, or being a spouse, or being, a child, or whatever it might be, it doesn't matter in that moment if you can just get past that and let your body move.
Yeah, very well said, man. I want to pivot a little bit to Cornell 77, which I'm not sure if I'm correct about this, but I thought that is coming out in paperback edition, or is.
If it is, I haven't heard.
Okay.
They did talk about it at one point, but I don't know that.
Okay.
I know it's an audiobook. Yeah.
Did you do the reading for it?
I didn't. No, I didn't do the reading.
But
that's not as weird as the fact that there's an audiobook version of Growing Up Dead that I didn't read either, and that's my memoir.
That is actually your life.
It's my life, yeah. So I can't listen to it. Not that the person did a bad job or anything. It's just too weird.
It's just way too weird. Too weird. But anyway, the book is fantastic. Obviously, it's about, the Cornell 77 show, which is widely held to be the one, I've gone through periods where I was, maybe just to be sort of, just kind of being like, Buffalo's just as good the next day, I've come back. I don't think Buffalo's quite as good. That isn't really the point. Some spring 90s shows might be as good. But at any rate, this is the one for many reasons, and it's certainly the one worthy of writing a full tome about, but I would imagine it was a little daunting. And interestingly, while reading, I'm like, I don't want this to end. So I don't know if it was hard, to write an entire book about that. But, now that you have a little space between you and the book has been out and was included in the box set and, is very critically well received. What are your thoughts on Cornell 77? I mean, is it still the one? Is it, and if it is there one thing you can point to? I mean, there, Phil's killing. Oh my God, the drums sound great. Betty did such an amazing job recording. But it can't just be is there one thing that just makes it magic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a way, things accrue their own meaning,
Yeah,
whether we want to have them mean that or not. It becomes almost like this Rosetta Stone of like, or a way to discuss this band, and debating whether or not, this show is worthy of that is part of that experience of being a deadhead and debating these things.
totally.
So ironically, people could argue against it, and at the same time, they're sort of reinforcing this idea that it's a worthy show to have this discussion around. And it's an exceptional show. I love the next night in Buffalo,
Yeah.
the beginning,
Oh,
especially
helps with
and
Frank. Yeah.
yeah, and I interviewed somebody, and it says it in the book, who said, "Oh, Buffalo is like the third set of Cornell. Like the first set of Buffalo is essentially the third set of Cornell," which I thought was an interesting.
It's a good comment, and it's only 24 hours later. I mean, maybe they didn't go to sleep yet.
It'll be possible.
It was 1977, after all.
Right. Yeah. So, I think it is worth talking about, because for whatever reason, whether people like it or not, like, it's become an interesting show to discuss.
Yeah.
It's become a way to talk about the band and the experience. And so when I was first approached by Cornell University Press to write the book, should say it was not my idea. It was the idea of the then publisher named Dean Smith, who had recently been hired by Cornell University Press, was a deadhead, knew that this anniversary was coming up, and really wisely was like, we should release a book about it with the press. And so they approached me and asked if I'd be willing to do it, and I said no when they first came, because it just seems so out there, and I was kind of like, well, it seems like a little bit of a reach, like, what am I going to say? And I didn't want to write a book where I was just saying the same thing over and over. It's an awesome show.
Right.
And I should say that was probably a little bit of a creative failure on my part to not push myself, which when they came back and asked again, I finally got to the place where I went, okay, let's say if I say yes, how do I do it?
Yeah.
And then it became an interesting creative puzzle challenge to say, how do I write an entire book about a single show? And in a way, like, I love that aspect as much as I loved talking about the Grateful Dead. Creatively, I also love the challenge of how do you possibly do this? And I think in some sense, what I learned is I could write a book about anything. Mm-hmm. If you just figure out how to, position it right and how to look at it. So don't just look at, here's the show and here's the songs they played, but what was going on at the time?
Right.
What was going on at the time in America? What was going on at the time in the band? What was going on musically at that time? And then breaking down the songs and, what songs did they play and what meaning did they have and what's their background? And so all sorts of things. So it was fun to write, and, completely obsessive. Yeah. I mean, to write an entire book about a single show is nothing but obsessive, but I will, stick with, I think it's a worthy show to talk about for that reason. It was undeniably a great era for the band. You mentioned spring 1990, another standout, era for the band that Weir, especially himself, will say, like, he says spring 1990 was like their best period ever.
Yeah.
I was there for the whole tour. I agree with him, except for 77 was also great, and I love 73, and all these different things
too.
yeah, exactly. So, but it was a standout, era for the band, and the show is just really solid, front to back. There's no clunkers in there. There's no, it just is great, and it showcases different aspects of the band that people are drawn to. So, whether it's the Bakersfield country vibe that gets in there with, Mama Tried and things like that, or, the transition a lot of people talk about between Scarlet Begonias and Fire on the Mountain, which is an exceptional transition that links those two songs together that they played, really, really well there. There's this stellar version of Morning Dew at the end of the show that's, has Jerry sort of emoting at his highest volume, his highest frequency. And at one point, I asked the oh my gosh, I can't believe I just blanked on his name. The publicist for the band for years and years, Dennis McNally.
Great guy.
I was asked Dennis McNally, I interviewed him for the book, and he's been super supportive and has helped me with different projects along the way. For anyone who doesn't know, he really wrote the definitive history of the Grateful
Of
Dead.
the full
So,
band, yeah. It's
yeah, and was their publicist, handpicked by Jerry because Jerry liked his book about Jack
That's
Kerouac.
right. There we go. The connections continue.
That's it. So that's how Dennis got in. Dennis is actually a PhD in history, and that's his training. But in any case, I asked him, why didn't Jerry? He got this reaction at the end of Morning Dew and that Cornell show that completely blew the room up. It completely just destroys the whole place, and it's beautiful and gorgeous, and it builds and builds and builds. And I said, well, why didn't he just do that? He knew he could do it.
Yeah.
You know what? And his thing was, well, he was a musician. He wasn't a performer. And so if you know the one trick you can do and you do it every night, you just become sort of like that's your shtick.
It loses meaning every time you do it then.
It loses meaning, So it's still surprising for me when like I'll realize that some bands like say and do the exact same thing from show to show, even like the between song patter and stuff like that. I'm so like coming from a different place that I'm always amazed when I hear that's the case. Because Garcia wouldn't even play the riff that will get the whole room blown. Because God forbid he plays the same thing that works every time, So, I mean, that kind of says a lot about the band and where they're coming from. And quite honestly, why so many of us are obsessed with them. Because what was he going to do next? If he didn't do that, it's got to go a different direction,
And it's it teaches you how to inhabit the moment, right? Because that music trains you to, because it was always the next moment. They didn't repeat things, Even if the set list was vaguely similar, it would sound so radically different, That's why there can be a whole box set of that tour. And it's all worth listening to. You already know. Yeah. Preaching to the choir.
Yeah, if you're open to it, then you can take a life lesson from that sort of willingness to take chances, that spontaneity, that experimentalism, that intellectual curiosity that led him out on that tightrope. I mean, these are ways you can actually live your life. And
that's what I was trying to get to. Yes.
Get that through listening to the Grateful Dead, if you're willing to go that deep into it.
Yeah, beautiful. And I'm glad you did this deep dive. I'm glad you followed it through, because I don't know. Again, if I have a criticism, I wish it was longer. Not really, but you know what I mean?
Quite honest, I had to finish it because it was, as you mentioned, it was included in the box set called Get Show in the Light. That was the release of that Cornell show and also some other shows from '77, including Buffalo. And there was a deadline to get it finished. And interestingly, I'll also say that Rhino Records, who released that and is the Dead's record label, would not even admit that they were releasing that until the book was already through its first proof and corrections and was just about to be released. And I was in close touch with them. They gave us the Steal Your Face for the cover. I have interviews with the president of Rhino throughout it and everything like that. But they were so close, tight-lipped about it that I had to actually go back and revise the book right before it came out to include the fact that it was being released finally.
Wow. All right, so right to the deadline. I love it, and it's a wonderful addition to Dead scholarship that belongs with Dennis's work and Blake's, I guess, Garcia biography. But yeah, thank you for that, man. And anyone listening who, even if you don't consider yourself that into the Grateful Dead, I think reading this book really, Peter writes like the music sounds, so I think it's a great entry point, a window into that world for anyone who wants to drop their cynicism and enter that world. It is healthy, and it does teach you to make some good decisions in your life, even though the long association between that band and drugs, that's not what it's about. Okay, enough proselytizing for me. We talked about the quality of that recording, the Betty boards. We owe an immense debt. But what that makes me think of is so many, I'm sure you too, we're the same age, we came at it at the same time. You heard tapes before you saw the band. I think you just said that. You said Hershey. That doesn't sound like a big deal right now, but I mean, I heard tapes because, I mean, my first job at 14 when I got my working papers was working in a pizza kitchen. And the older guy there was a deadhead, and he controlled the boombox, and he came in with his tapes. I heard all these shows, and at first I'm like, what is that? That doesn't sound like, what I think I was listening to a lot of Yes at the time, or not putting that down. It's great music, but I didn't understand. And then I did, because I kept hearing it over and over again. But you can hear full bands on tour who have adopted that model now. We can stream their shows. We can often stream them live and watch them, high quality. But can you maybe talk for people who didn't have that experience? I still have my tapes, what a game changer that was. How important that was to the community because this wasn't a commercial band that was going to be played on the radio. The community that came up around tape swapping and just sharing, it was such a game changer, and it's maybe hard to see how significant that was in the present day.
Yeah, it is because it's such a relic at this point when we can just click and, I can go to archives.org and listen to every single show that the Great Dead played.
And I do
and
it.
I can, right, pick different versions. Oh, I don't like that version quite as much. And so, it's hard to even remember what a currency tapes were in that community. And by currency, I mean, like, they had such value and you could trade them for other tapes. Now, you couldn't sell them because that was a part of the ethos, was that you don't sell this music, you would trade it.
And people didn't. They didn't sell it. I never saw anyone selling it.
No, and they didn't, right? People respected that. And, another interesting thing that I talk about in Cornell 77 is that people just assume that the Dead were these geniuses and they allowed taping right away, and they didn't. The Dead tried to squash tapers in different ways, and
they gave
if
up.
not actively at times, the venues they were playing at, or the promoters or whatever, different people tried to stop. And Deadheads were just, they came up with these ingenious ways to continue taping the shows. But part of the problem was that they were messing with everybody around them, whether they were putting up mic stands to get in their way or just, tapers can be a pretty obsessive bunch. So they would be aggressively shushing people around them or whatever, and it was causing problems. To finally, they got to the point where it was like, let's create an area where we can just put these people. We can't stop them. They're kind of messing with everything around them, So let's give them an area that they can just be in. And that's really where taping as we know it properly started, and the quality of the tapes got better.
Way better.
People didn't have to speak in everything. And it ended up seeding these, particularly around the Northeast, it seeded what, and I go again back to Dennis McNally, what became the Dead's meat and potatoes, what really financially allowed them to do their thing was the Northeast. And the Northeast was seeded a lot by these tapes, particularly going through the college campuses and the college campus tours that they really were pioneering starting in around 70, going to, Harper College, probably doesn't even, now it's, I guess, Binghamton.
Yeah.
Playing at, Colgate or playing all these different little colleges. And then when they would go, the tapes would be there and people would trade the tapes. And so the next time the Dead came through, the legend of them playing that last show and also the recordings were there, and it grew by legions. And so just like you had your pizza place guy who was playing the tape, there's countless Big Brothers or My Roommate, or whatever. Somebody was the one who had the tape, and it was almost always the tape.
Yeah.
The tape, and that got me going. So it ended up, as often happened with the Dead in business, they sort of stumbled ass backwards into this brilliant, marketing thing of allowing people to record their shows. And it's such a part of the Deadhead community that, again, it seems like it was just always the case, but it really wasn't. And what we would go through to get a good quality tape was a lot, and it was, you get into like generations of tape, right? So is it a soundboard that came directly from a patch into the soundboard that the Dead were using? Or was it a first generation, means it was tape from that, or second or third? And, you sort of start out, most people low on the totem pole, and you're getting not good quality sounding tapes, and there are generations back. And there's a magazine still around called Relics.
Yes.
that is a great music magazine that started as a place for people to connect and trade tapes.
That's what it was born from. And it's one of the best music magazines in existence right now, I think.
Yeah.
We
And
don't,
still very much about, that community and the jam band community. And it's expanded somewhat beyond that, but it's kind of our magazine of record.
yes. um, you've written a lot of poetry, and now you're also a novelist with Merch Table Blues, which explores elements of friendship and community that I think anyone who's ever been on the bus, will find some, they'll recognize that. And the novel kind of makes me think of, what Jack Straw would be if it was blown out into a novel, in a way, like we were talking about Hunter's just brilliant observational writing. I'm wondering if you could talk about the connection between music and literature as it's applied to your life. You have a bit, but I'm also wondering if you can talk specifically about the influence of Hunter and a little bit about Barlow, because you did talk about Hunter on your own writing.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, I'm not, I'm not a musician. I'm a writer, and so, I think what I realized with touring with the Grateful Dead, and at a certain point, like, I knew that it wasn't about my level of commitment to the band. It was about taking the lessons that I gained there and taking that into my own artistic field and taking that spontaneity, that sense of taking a risk, and also pursuing something that I was passionate about, which is exactly what the Grateful Dead did throughout their career. I was very passionate about following the band and so forth, but I was also very passionate about my own writing. And I knew at a certain point, like, if I wanted to become my own person, my own artist and everything, I had to put that same passion into writing, but take all those lessons.
Yeah.
And what I got from those guys in particular, I think probably more than anything, was an appreciation for imagery.
Yeah.
And the value of wordplay, because there's a lot of puns and there's a lot of like alliteration, and there's sort of, it's a real playful use of of language, and also poetic.
They make it look easy. It's not.
Yeah. And, kudos to Garcia and to Weir for being such good translators and communicators of it too. I mean, the pace that Garcia brings to singing Hunter's lyrics is, it's beyond comparison, right? So, I mean, you take a song like Wharf Rat, for example, and think of Garcia singing that song, and you believe every damn word that he's saying somehow every time he sings it. But you take that same song and you give it to somebody else, and I'm not going to name names because it kind of doesn't matter. The point is, Garcia knew how to get inside those songs and embody them and make you feel what was going on. So I think, it made me appreciate the value of these small images, the language play, and so forth, and also pay attention to what their influences are.
Yeah.
And try and learn, through that. And I'm not somebody, I didn't go and get an MFA in creative writing. I basically went to Potsdam College because it was pretty central to tour and it didn't cost a lot of money.
Right.
And I wasn't going to be there mostly. So, my sort of formal education is nothing to really cheer about. But what I did do really studiously was to track down influences. So if I liked something, I found out who they liked, and then I kept going down and digging out. And that's where you get from, like, Garcia to Dostoevsky.
Totally.
Immediate line, right? So I think I got that, I think I got that sense of play, language, imagery, and also, like, what is that lineage?
Yeah.
Because to me, this is the lineage of American heroes. When I think of American history and my American heroes, I don't go to George Washington, or, Abraham Lincoln or whoever. I have my own heroes, and most of them with long hair and beards and, were on the fringes. But to me, it is the old weird history of America.
Yeah.
Right?
Well said. The old weird America. And it is a conduit to that. So is it fair to say through Hunter, you found Allen Ginsberg or Kerouac? I mean, is that how it worked for you?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And yeah, I mean, I had not heard of any of the beat writers until I got into the Grateful Dead. Absolutely, hands down. And I've since written a book about Timothy Leary and
Yeah.
Allen Ginsberg's relationship called White Hand Society. And it's really interesting because in that book, I write about Richard Alpert, who was partners with Timothy Leary during their acid, experiments at Harvard, who went on to become Ram Dass.
Yes.
And I've since become very devoted to Ram Dass and to Babanik Baroli, his guru. And, when you start going back and tracing it, Ram Dass, at that time, Richard Alpert, was at the first acid test. And so you have this massive branch of American spirituality that ties into our current mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
Without Ram Dass, without that movement from the 60s, we would not have mindfulness today so accepted in American society. And this person was present at the very first Grateful Dead acid test.
It's just so crazy.
Not only do I have the Jack Kerouac and all that stuff, but even as I age and have new experiences and sort of, investigate different areas, I'll be damned if it doesn't keep tying back to the Grateful Dead. So, this is how I know that I found my tribe, and I feel really fortunate for that.
That's right.
Yeah.
Wow. I guess that answers why music matters pretty well. I mean, almost every strain of your life is somehow, I'm sure personal relationships, friendship, and family came out of this as well,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah. You and I fell for the Dead around the same time, and there was some unfortunate stuff going on around then. We talked about not all Dead fans managed to drop their cynicism, right? And they called us touch heads or whatever, even though that's just so wrong and kind of meaningless. But I thought it was ridiculous then. But interestingly, I've encountered that same kind of prejudicial attitude expressed toward young people whose first live experience of Grateful Dead music might have been last summer seeing Deadco. And for me, that's, last summer's Deadco tour. I watched, streamed, studied every show. It's some of the greatest live Grateful Dead music I've seen since Garcia died, and that's a personal opinion. And people still look at me like I'm nuts when they say that. Like, I'm wondering, I have two questions related to this kind of, I'm so excited to see young people who maybe their first experience of this. Someone on Instagram put a picture of Bobby from a show, and they were like a 22-year-old, and they said, "I'd like to thank this guy for giving everything he had left in the tank so that I would know what this was about." All right, they don't know all of it, but they know some of it. Two questions related. What were your thoughts on the summer 2023 tour? And also, do you agree that the entire point of this was that it was supposed to be passed on, and that, that it was supposed to transcend Jerry Garcia's death?
Yeah, because, here's the thing. There's, and, obviously the guys in the band know this better than anyone. Like, there's a lot of lessons that come through with being a part of this community. And I will say I'm very motivated as a writer to write about these scenes as a way to transmit that information to future generations, because this is my American history, and because I do think there are really important lessons about how to live in the world that you can get through this. And absolutely, do they believe that? Sure they do. Of course, they've dedicated their whole lives to it. So, I have a real issue with anybody bagging on somebody who came in a different time.
Yeah.
Because I will tell you, the people who came in at 72 weren't at the acid test.
Right.
And the people who came in at 77 were cheesy disco,
right.
heads, and they like dancing in the streets, and that's so, disco, blah, 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 Shakedown Street,
right.
All this different. So, every era has assholes, what
totally.
I mean? Who are what? Yeah. So, it's just not a part of my worldview, my dead worldview. Yeah. And I like to, we keep talking about cynicism. I feel like I want to say, like, just leave your cynicism at the door and try it out without it, because you can always go back and pick up your cynicism later.
Yeah, it'll be sitting there.
It'll still be there waiting for you. You can be just as cynical afterwards, but try it without it, just to see. And that should extend to the people around you who are discovering it for the first time. I freaking love seeing kids at shows. I think it's the most amazing thing. And, now we're talking about 3 generations easy, if not maybe going into 4 generations of people there. And I think it's so cool, not just for the music, but for what it tells people and what it can teach people about living,
Yeah.
And so what I think about the tour, I thought it was the best Dead and Company tour I'd seen. And I agree with you, some of the best Dead music that I've seen post Garcia live, certainly. And I mean, I will say, like, without a doubt, I'm a John Mayer fan. I was before. I really like John Mayer trio stuff in particular. Too. I think Continuum's a stellar album.
That's the one.
Oh my God, he's a phenomenal guitar player. Just, a stellar musician, a great songwriter. And he is passionate about this music because he doesn't have to do this.
No way.
John Mayer does not need to do this. He has learned, and you can see the growth of him through interviews. He's learned how to live as a result of interacting with this music, which is what we're talking about.
Totally.
Why does it matter? The Dead music matters to him, and he's passionate about it. And he has gotten inside of the music to this level where, he doesn't have the blocky blues solos that he had when he first started, because he was playing John Mayer, playing the Grateful Dead. And I think he's gotten past himself and his own stylistic quirks, still having those flourishes, but able to be much more fluid in the music. And I think also willing to take risks, which I give him a lot of credit for, because his position with his reputation, his career, does not need to take risks.
No.
He doesn't need to go up there and potentially flub solos and all this different stuff, which he's done, and everybody does. And if you don't,
you can't not.
Wrong.
I'm a musician.
Yeah.
You can't play that without risking. If you play 2 sets of Grateful Dead music, you will make mistakes. If you don't, you're not doing it right.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought the tour was exceptional. I was really, I'm bummed out that they stopped. And I'm also, will bring in my own cynicism. I'm a little cynical that they won't, start up again. And if they do, I will be very happy and I'll go to the show.
They can have my money. I loved it. And I'm glad you said that about Mayer, because if when you watch this, you watched him grow. This is everything we've been talking about. You watched this music help him evolve. And he's way better than he was when he started, and I was a fan too. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And I don't know what you think about this, and it's a bit of an aside and a little nerdy, but I thought Jay Lane changed the game kind of for that tour. And this isn't throwing anything at Billy, but immense respect and gratitude. But it was different. And all of a sudden, you've got Oteil playing with Jay Lane and Mickey on top of that, and everything became just groovier.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm going to see Billy at the Capitol Theater in a couple of weeks.
I love
playing
him.
with kids a couple nights. I love Billy, and I've had a couple of really cool personal experiences with Billy too.
He's the man.
For a different time, he's the man. But to see these young guys, I mean, this is part of the cool thing about Dead and Company. To see the way that they interact with the music and at such high level. And Jeff Chimenti, the pianist, has been Bob Weir's musical director for decades.
Rat Dog,
Yeah,
and the
so
Wolf
he's
Brothers now.
He's inside of it, much more than these guys are. But you take somebody like Oteil or John Mayer, and then I agree, you drop in Jay Lane. The guy looked so happy every single time he hit that drum. I mean, big grin. He was thrilled. He was into it. That's infectious. It's infectious. And he's a great player. He adds a lot to the music, and he's just different. So I think my take on it would be Kreuzman would be the first to say, anybody who plays this music brings their own stuff to it, and Jay Lane's a great player. I thought he had a lot, and I just loved seeing his face up there, smiling and so happy.
That's the way
he knew what he was. He knew he was getting the experience of a lifetime.
Totally. It was so cool. Well, man, thank you so much for opening up about all this stuff, and And yeah, I mean, I just feel like there's no better band than the Dead to exemplify what what the idea of all this is why music matters and how it can elevate, transform, and change. And now for multiple generations, And thank you for all that you've added to the scholarship around this and the enjoyment of the ride for me personally, and I know a lot of others too. I lastly want to know what are you working on now? What are you up to? What's next?
I'm actually working on a novel that is a prequel to Merch Table Blues.
Awesome.
That is basically Merch Table Blues is like a band with a cult following. I call it a sex, drugs, and rock and roll murder mystery. The band's on tour. There's murders going on along it, and you sort of figure out who that is. This is about the origins of the cult that is following the band at that time, and specifically the cult leader and where he came from. And it ended up going in different directions that I hadn't foreseen at all. So it's a novel about music and a cult and obsession and all that sort of fun stuff.
Are you deep into it?
Yeah, I am. It's pretty much written, and now I'm just giving it space to breathe, and then I go back to it after I let it sit for a little while. So I'm in a little gestation period with it.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to it, man. I appreciate your time. I hope I see you at a show soon. And thanks for being here, brother. I'll see you around.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for all you do.
Take care, man.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Peter.